Well, thank you very much, Harald, for these very kind words. I am extremely glad and honored to be giving this lecture today. And even more so, I'm extremely honored to be a part of this amazing Department of Economics and to call all the other professors in this department my colleagues. It's really a very great honor. All right, so this is about behavioral public policy with applications to finance. Now, in public policy, the overarching question we try to answer is, how should we set policy that produces outcomes that are good for society and for individuals? Now, let me give you a couple of examples. Yesterday, if you're Swiss, you voted on a behavioral public policy, which is whether we should have an opt-in or an opt-out system for registering as an organ donor. And we now have an opt-out system. You have to say, I don't want to be an organ donor if you don't want to be one. There are many other examples of behavioral public policy, like traffic light labeling to inform people whether food is healthy or not. Similar labeling when it comes to energy consumption, or conflict of interest disclosures in financial advice. Now, why are these policies behavioral? Well, they all address issues which in standard economics simply don't even exist. When you assume that people are perfectly rational and perfectly informed, something like an opt-in or opt-out policy just doesn't make a difference. So in behavioral economics, we account for the fact that we're dealing with real humans who sometimes make mistakes, who have self-control problems, and so forth. And there's basically two parts to behavioral public policy. One is behavioral welfare economics, which asks the question, what type of mistakes do people make, and what policies effectively improve decisions? Now, what mistakes people make might be obvious because it's easy to have an opinion about whether somebody else's decision is good or bad. But when we inform policymaking, we would like to have more than an opinion. We would have to have scientific evidence. And that, as you're going to see, is much harder to obtain. The second question is positive welfare economics. So we're trying to describe what type of policies individuals and policymakers will demand, and whether perhaps their demands for policies are afflicted by biases and mistakes, because policymakers too are human. So let me get started with behavioral welfare economics, in particular with an application to personal finance. Now, the motivation for this is that financial literacy around the world is really low. So here's an example. My co-author, Anna Maria Lusardi, asked this question to people around the world. Suppose you had $100 in a savings account and the interest rate is 2% per year. After 5 years, do you think you would have more than, less than, or exactly $102? Second question. Suppose the inflation rate, the interest rate on your savings account is 1% per year, and inflation is 2% per year. After 1 year, you think you can buy more than, less than, or just as much as today. Third question. Buying a single company stock usually provides a safer return than a stock mutual fund. Now, these are the answers. If you decide how to save for retirement, if you decide how much to invest in your third pillar, or if you live in the US where there's nothing like mandatory retirement savings, you have a lot of financial responsibility. You have to be able to answer all of these three questions right to make even remotely sensible decisions. The problem, though, is that when you ask a representative sample of Americans, not even a third of them can answer all of these questions correctly. And we're not exactly doing great in Switzerland either. About half of us can answer all of these questions correctly. And that's why most OECD member countries, as well as India and China, have implemented policies to enhance financial literacy. They're spending millions and billions on these policies. Now, an important question is whether these policies actually help, whether they actually help people make better decisions. So you got to scientifically evaluate whether that's the case, and there's two conventional approaches by which people usually do that. One is you start from an assumption, say that people are not saving enough. Then you educate them, or you do some other type of behavioral intervention, and you see whether they start saving more. That's a directional change in behavior. Another thing you can do is you ask questions about the financial topic to some people, you educate them, you check whether they become better at answering these questions. And if they do, that kind of suggests they might now make better decisions. But there are a couple of assumptions involved, and so it's not clear that we can really trust these decisions. So that's what we want to look at in this paper, and we want to suggest that we can actually do better. And this is not just about financial education. This is about evaluating behavioral interventions much more broadly, also not just in the domain of finance, but also in the domain of energy conservation or food, healthy food choices. So here's a very simple overview of the experiment. We give some people education about compound interest, one of the most basic topics in personal finance. Other people, well, they don't just sit around, but they get educated about something that's not relevant for the decisions that we're going to measure. We also do another experiment, which is exactly the same, except that after educating people, we have them practice and we give them feedback about how well they did and where they could improve. And now we're going to look at what would we conclude about these interventions using the standard methodology. So let's give them questions about compound interest, 5 questions. How well do they do? Well, in both experiments, if they don't get educated, they get about 2 out of 5 questions correct. If we do give them education, they get about 3.5 correct, so there's a very big effect. And it's almost the same, regardless of whether or not people practiced. We are economists, so we would like to see behavior as well. So we give people choices. So we ask them essentially, or we ask them explicitly, which one would you rather have? Say, $10 today, or $10 in an account with 1% interest per day, compounded daily for 70 days, and at the end of the 72 days, we'll give you everything that's in the account. We ask you that same question, but instead of $10 today, we ask about $12 today, and so forth. And so that way, we measure the amount of money that people like just as well if received today as if they received the investment. Now, what would we expect from a successful intervention? Well, we know that people tend to underestimate how quickly interest compounds, or they underestimate any type of exponential growth, also how quickly pandemics spread. That's the exponential growth bias. So we would expect that absent education, people's reservation prices, the amount of money today they consider as good as the investment, will be too low. And we should expect that a successful intervention would increase these reservation prices. Well, what happens in the experiment? So for this investment, people say, well, about $12 today is just as good as the investment, regardless of whether or not we have them practice. No, sorry, that's in the control. The education helps people ostensibly make better decisions. So they now say about $15 today is as good as the investment. And that doesn't depend on whether or not they practice compound interest. So what would we conclude from these conventional measures? Well, we see people do better in exam-style test questions, and we see a behavioral change in the expected direction. So doesn't that suggest that people would now make better decisions when compound interest is involved in their financial choices? Well, there's a second result, which is that because the effects are so similar across the experiment, it looks like that practice with feedback didn't have an effect at all. Turns out these conclusions are totally wrong. And I have used the methodology that a large literature is using to evaluate these things. So let me show why these conclusions are wrong and how we can do better. Well, to answer this question, we have to answer the question, what is a good decision? Which also gets us to the distinction between behavioral and standard economics. In standard economics, there's no such thing as a bad decision because we use revealed preferences. So we say, basically, you chose it, therefore you must have wanted it. So every decision is good. In behavioral economics, we acknowledge that people make mistakes, and so some decisions will be bad, but we also want to acknowledge that people are different. They have different preferences, different circumstances, and we want to account for those. So we don't want to just say, your valuation should be $18. That would be paternalistic. So how can we measure the quality of decision-making? So here's our approach that is similar to the approach that's taken in other papers in behavioral public economics. So a good decision is one that you would have made if you understood the consequences of your choices. Let me see how we test that. Let me show you how we test that. So this is what the decisions that I've already shown you. We present people with that investment, and we ask for the amount of money received today that is as good as the investment. We also ask them a second question. What amount of money paid today is as good as $20 received in 72 days? Now, the thing is, these decisions have exactly the same consequences. If you know your rule of 72, you know that the investment compounds to $20. So somebody who understands compound interest, who applies that knowledge when making choices, they should have the same valuation regardless of how we ask that question. The larger the difference we see in what people tell us is the amount of money today that is equivalent to the future prospect, the larger the difference across the way we ask the question, the worse the person's decisions are. And if you're an economist, you're now going to have lots of questions, how robust is this, and what's the theoretical underpinnings. That's all in the 100 pages of paper. I'm not going to go through that. Instead, I'm showing you the results. How do you think of these results? This is CDF. So think of us as we align all the people on the y-axis, and we put the dependent variable on the x-axis. The dependent variable is what you tell us is your value for the investment when you frame it as an investment minus your value when we just tell you it's $20 in 70 days. So if you tell me, when I ask you about $20 in 70 days, you tell me, well, I think that's worth $15 to me. And for the investment, you tell me, I think that's worth $10 to me. Then you have a difference of 5, right? So in this case, you'd be located at -5 here. You undervalue the investment. Okay, and so what you can see from this graph is that about half the people undervalue the investment, but about half the people are either close to correct or overvalue the investment. Now, what would good education do? It would make those people who undervalue who undervalue the investment undervalue it less, and it would make those people who overvalue the investment overvalue it less. What does education actually do when we don't have people practice? This is what happens. It just basically tells everybody compound interest is more powerful than you previously thought. And people get that message even if they overestimated compound interest from the start. And we induce those people to make worse decisions. And as it happens, the amount of welfare gains and the amount of welfare losses to the other people about cancel each other out. So overall, there's nothing in terms of welfare improvement. We get a very different picture when we look at the intervention that includes practice with feedback. In that case, we only get the beneficial effect, but we don't get the countervailing harmful effect. So we can conclude that the second intervention works well, the first intervention doesn't work at all, and that is completely different from the conclusions we would have drawn using the conventional methods. And we have additional treatments to show why the conventional methods fail. The message of this paper is we are spending a lot of money on behavioral public policy, and it's crucial that we evaluate this correctly. It's also a method that you can apply much more broadly, so we're working on a paper where we look at whether people who follow particular investment styles, like contrarian investing or momentum investing, whether they actually receive the returns distribution that they like, or whether they're confused about what their actions, what consequences their actions produce. Let me, instead of going into these papers, let me show you how people make good and bad decisions outside the domain of finance. So this gets close to what you voted on yesterday. So I'm now going to talk about transactions like clinical trial participation, or surrogate motherhood, or human egg donation. Now, for transactions like these, they are often legal, but only if you don't take too much money for it. So for instance, in the US, for a long time, as a woman, you could donate eggs, but only if you didn't take more than $10,000 for it. As a clinical trial participant, typically, you can't take more money than $3,000. Why? You know, if you're a hairdresser, you can't take more than $25 per hour, that would be very confusing. Why would we do that? Well, in this domain, the ethicists have this concept of undue inducement. That's the idea that when we offer people money for doing something, that might be so attractive that it clouds their rational judgment. And it causes them to fixate on the benefits and to neglect the downsides. The American Society for Reproductive Medicine says explicitly that payments to women providing human eggs should be not so substantial that they'll lead donors to discount risks. The higher the payment, the greater the possibility that women will discount risks. And that's why they say we should limit these payments. And if that hypothesis is right, well, limiting these payments is good. But we don't know, right? Perhaps if we limit the payments, we are just basically exploiting people by underpaying them for their valuable services. Fortunately, it's a testable hypothesis, whether higher incentives lead to worse decision-making. And that's what I set out to do in this paper. Now, I cannot pay women to donate eggs or, started my clinical trial, so I have to find something else that I can actually do. And I would like to incentivize people for something that is aversive to them, that they don't quite know about yet, and also something where if they want to deceive themselves that it's less bad than they previously thought, they have an opportunity to do so. So this is a transaction I choose. I pay people actual money to make them eat actual bugs, actual insects. And you can ask my daughter what they taste like. It's actually not that bad. So the way the experiment goes is, if you're a participant in my experiment, you'll learn. You'll get $3 if you agree to eat these bugs. Other participants learn they'll get $30 if they agree to eat these bugs. Now I want to see whether, if I offer you more money, whether you go and deceive yourself into believing that these things are less bad than you thought. So I give you 2 videos, and you can select one, only one, and watch it. One is called Why You May Want to Eat Insects, the other is called Why You May Not Want to Eat Insects. Now, we would expect that if people try to deceive themselves with higher amounts of money, they would be more likely to want to see the positive video. Well, after people have seen the video, I don't give them any further information about the insects, except for this description. I ask them, well, now do you want to eat 5 roasted whole large mealworms unflavored in exchange for the incentive I've promised you? And then people say yes or no, and depending on what they say, they eat the insects and receive $30. So what happens? How often, as a function of the incentive amount, do people want to see the encouraging video? Well, you can see that if we offer a low incentive, about 80% of people want to see the encouraging video. If the incentive amount is higher, we get an additional 10% of people who want to watch the positive video. So that is quite consistent with the concerns of the ethicists that high incentives will lead donors to discount risks, and that the higher the payment, the greater the possibility that women will discount risks. Right? They become less interested in seeing the cautious video, and they look as if they want to persuade themselves to participate. But this is not a measure of the quality of decision-making. This is just the behavioral measures. So do higher incentives really cause worse decisions? Well, let me make 2 arguments. First, I'm going to show you we shouldn't even expect that theoretically. And second, I'm going to measure whether people actually make worse decisions. So here's the theoretical argument. The results I've shown you so far are perfectly consistent with completely rational decision-making, as long as it's costly to obtain complete information about the transaction you're about to engage in. I ask myself, well, how do incentives affect what type of information a perfectly rational subject wants to see if they cannot see all information? Because, you're not going to get a PhD degree or not going to get a MD degree before you decide whether or not to donate eggs. Well, if information is costly, you make decisions based on partial information, which means that you can make 2 types of mistakes. One type of mistake is that you say, yes, I'll do this thing, even though had you fully understood the consequences, you would have said no. The other type of mistake is that you say, no, I'm not going to do this thing, even though had you had full information, you would have done it. Now, what type of information do you want to see? Well, if you optimize, you just want to make more expensive mistakes less often, right? The thing is, the incentive I offer you for participation determines which type of mistake is the more expensive mistake. If I offer you a very low incentive, you have little to gain from the transaction, but potentially a lot to lose. So you want to see cautious information. You want to look into the downsides. If I offer you a high incentive, well, now, all of a sudden, saying no by mistake becomes the costly mistake, and saying yes by mistake becomes cheaper. So now you want to see different information, more encouraging information. So we see that even for a perfectly rational subject, a higher incentive will cause that subject to bias their information search towards more encouraging sources. So the thing that the ethicists are worried about is perhaps entirely rational behavior. But people are not perfectly rational, so we better test what's actually going on. So the way I test that is, after people have made their participation decisions, I actually hand out little containers with the insects in them. And in each container on the bottom, I have a little piece of paper with a code, so people have to take that out and enter it in the computer, which forces them to look at these insects, to touch them, to smell them. And so they have much more information about what it's going to be like to eat these things. So you might, you're going to interact with all of these insects, 2 field crickets, 5 mealworms, 2 house crickets, 3 silkworm pupae, 5 mole crickets. These are the worst. They smell really bad, too. But after you have that information, I ask you, well, now you know what this entails. What's the least amount of money for which you're willing to do this? Would you do it for free? Would you do it for $1? Would you do it, I go up and up until $60? So now I can define how much people benefited from being given a transaction at the incentive they were promised, or whether they made a mistake, right? I can look at, suppose you told me, yes, I'm going to eat these things for $30. And then, once you've seen the things, you tell me, they're really nasty. I got to have $50 to do it. Your decision was a mistake, and the cost of the mistake to you was $20, right? You would need 50, but you only get 30. There's also surplus, right? If you said, yes, I'm going to eat these things, then you see them, and they're not as bad as you thought. So you would eat them, say, for 15, but you agreed to eat them for 30, then you just gained $15. So we can now look at what the distribution of the surplus measure looks like. And this, again, is a CDF, so think of this as we line up all the individuals on the y-axis, and we plot the surplus on the x-axis. Now, what you can see is that there are 10 to 20% of people, depending on treatment, whose decisions are mistaken. They accept, but once they receive the insects, they think they're worse than the money they received for them. A lot of people have positive surplus. The important thing, though, is the blue line that's the distribution of surplus amongst those who got the high incentive. The red line is the distribution of surplus amongst those who got the low incentive. And you can see that giving people the high incentive just shifts the curve to the right. So essentially, in distribution, everybody becomes better off. It's not the case that higher incentives lead to more mistaken decisions, even though we've seen that information biasing that I've shown you before. What that means, if you're a theorist, is that regardless of what type of welfare function you want to apply to these decisions, higher incentives are better. So we've shown that using empirical data about the quality of people's choices, the undue inducement hypothesis just is not correct. This is not ex ante obvious, as some theorists sometimes say. Well, if you assume rational subjects, it's obvious rational subjects never hurt themselves. But we're looking at real people here, and I've shown you they do hurt themselves sometimes. It's just that higher incentives don't lead to much worse decisions in a way that would justify capping the incentives. And here, too, this is a very long paper. I have many other experiments or many other robustness checks and so forth. So this result is very robust. Okay, let me now go to the second part of behavioral public economics, or behavioral public policy, the part of positive welfare economics. I have just shown you that the intuitions that policymakers have about the quality of decisions in some cases are mistaken. The undue inducement hypothesis, it's really hard to get evidence for it. It's just hard to get people to harm themselves by offering them something good. More generally, policymakers are people. People make mistakes, so policymakers might make mistakes. And in democracies like Switzerland, it's us who are the policymakers, right? Us citizens who vote. So I want to see, in particular, when people decide to intervene with other people's choices, taking away options from them because they think those options would be bad for those people, whether there are mistakes and biases that people make when they make these types of choices. So here's how that experiment goes. I pair people up. One person is a chooser. The other person is a choice architect. The chooser is going to decide how he wants to get paid for his experiment participation. So he decides, would I rather have nothing today and 15.5 a year? Would I rather have 3 today and 10.5 a year? Or 5 today and 1.5 a year? Now, you can see that the more money you want to take today, the less money you get overall. And so if you're a choice architect, that's the person who decides which of these options will be available to the chooser. Now, if you're a choice architect, you might say, well, giving up €9 just so you get your money earlier, that doesn't seem like it would be a good decision. So I want to protect you from making the mistake and choosing that option. So I'm going to take that option away from you so you cannot possibly choose it. So that's the experiment design, and what we see is that people intervene quite often. So these are experimental subjects. These are students at University of Cologne. The least patient option is being removed a third of the time. So people try to force others to be more patient. Now, they do this because they want to help. People tell me explicitly, I wanted to protect the other person from himself. I wanted to force the future experiment participant to make the decision that's right for him. But how do they actually decide what's good and what's bad? If you believe the other person doesn't know what's good for them, how do you know what's good for them? That seems even a bit more difficult, right? So Adam Smith already had a hypothesis about that. He said, well, we don't have an immediate experience of what other men feel, so we can form no idea of the manner in which they're affected, but by conceiving what we ourselves should feel in the like situation. So you try to put yourselves into other people's shoes, and based on that, you try to help them make better decisions. Now, there's two ways in which you could try to do that. One way is you could ask yourself, well, what are the types of mistakes that I tend to make, and how can I help other people not make those mistakes? Now, if you are an impatient person, and you believe that being impatient is a mistake, you can't help yourself, but at least you can help the other people in the experiment, then we should see that the impatient choice architects will be more prone to intervening paternalistically. The other hypothesis is that of an ideals protective paternalist. That's a person who basically says, how do I help other people make better decisions? Well, my own decisions are pretty good, aren't they? So I'm just going to help other people make the same decisions that I would have made. And in that case, people will look as if they imposed their own preferences onto others. And so you should see that more patient choice architects are the ones who impose stricter restrictions. Now, to test which of these better describes what people are doing, we measure choice architects' own patience, and then we look at how does their own patience relate to their intervention decisions. So I make 5 bins of choice architects. The least patient choice architects are on the very left. The most patient ones are on the very right. On the y-axis, I show you basically how much money the chooser is allowed to borrow against the future payment. Right? If you allow the chooser to borrow a lot, you don't constrain him. If you allow the chooser only to borrow very little, you do constrain him. And what we can see is that the least patient choice architects intervene less than more patient choice architects, and that goes up all the way to the very most patient choice architects. So people look very much as if they're trying to impose their own preferences on others, rather than trying to help others not make the mistakes they tend to make themselves. You can also see that when you do a survey, so it gets away from this artificial experiment environment. We can ask our German subjects what would be good for the Swiss to do. So we can ask them, do you think it would be good for Switzerland to start the sugary drinks tax so they are more healthier as far as their sugar consumption is concerned? And by the way, how heavy are you? And so we can look at, is it the heavier people who prefer a sugary drinks tax, or is it the lighter people who prefer a sugary drinks tax? If people try to help others not make the mistakes that they tend to make themselves, well, we should expect that people who struggle with their own weight and think that's a mistake, that it's the heavier people who are more in favor of a sugary drinks tax. If people just want to impose their own preferences on others, well, then we should expect that it's the less heavy people who are more in favor of a sugary drinks tax. And that's exactly what we find. And we find that across a variety of other domains as well. People who drink less alcohol are more in favor of restricting other people's alcohol consumption. People who smoke less are more in favor of restricting others' tobacco consumption. And people who have less consumer debt are more in favor of restricting other people's consumer debt. Now, so people are ideals projective paternalists. They try to intervene with others' choices as if they try to impose their own choices on others. And we can actually show that a part of this must be a mistake. We know that people want to account for the preferences of those whom they intervene with, but they systematically mispredict how restrictive their interventions are. In particular, the most patient people, they underestimate how restrictive they are, and the least patient people, they overestimate how restrictive they are. And so, because they cannot correctly predict the effects of their interventions, even though they want to account for the other person's preferences, we know that the way in which they intervene must at least partially be a mistake. So what I've shown you here are the choices from laboratory subjects. you can also ask, well, what about people who are in professions where they have the potential to be paternalistic? And so let me take this presentation back to the start, to financial decisions. We are currently working on an experiment where we have professional paternalists, professional certified financial planners who practice in the US participate in an experiment. If you're a financial planner, you're often faced with quite naive clients, so you can be paternalistic by just not telling them about certain options that would be available to them. And we want to see how much people want to intervene in these choices. The way we do this is we recruit a lower middle-income individual, and that person will receive $20,000. And yes, we have recruited a person like that, and yes, they will receive $20,000. Now, one of the financial planners in this experiment, randomly selected, that planner's choices will determine how the client can invest the money. We'll hold that money in trust for the client for 10 years, and we'll invest it according to what the planner tells us we should do with the money. And in one of these decisions, the decision is just an asset allocation decision. So what percentage of the money do you want to put into a broad stock market fund, and what percentage do you want to put into a broad bond fund? The decisions by the certified financial planners are about how much discretion do I want to leave to that client? What part of the $20,000 do I want to let the client decide about? How much of that to put into the stock ETF or the bond ETF? And how much do I want to force the client? Now, we just got pilot results, so this is very much work in progress, but the results are already really quite stark. Out of the 15 planners we have so far, almost half leave absolutely no discretion at all. They completely determine what the client can do with the money, and none of the planners we have leave discretion over more than half of that money. And that's quite similar when we have people make other decisions. Rather than asset allocation decisions, we ask them how much they want to lock up in a 10-year systematic withdrawal plan. So, given we have very few subjects here, this is all we can say at the moment, but our main study questions are going to be about how do these decisions vary by client race and gender? Are financial planners, for instance, more paternalistic if they have female customers than if they have male customers, or if more paternalistic if they have black rather than white customers? And what predicts the advisor's decisions? So you know who you should ask for advice. Now, this is all to come in the future. Instead, let me summarize what I've told you about past research. The main question of behavioral public policy is, how can we set policy that produces outcomes that are good for society and individuals? There's two parts to this exercise. One is we look at what types of mistakes people make, and we try to figure out what produces better decisions. That's behavioral welfare economics. The other part is we try to figure out when do people make mistakes, or what types of mistakes do they make when they try to assess what would be good for others or for society. I've shown you that when we try to evaluate interventions that are supposed to help people make better decisions, the conventional methods that we've used to do that can be quite misleading. And I've shown you that we have a better method that you can use, at least in some circumstances. I've also shown you, when it comes to transactions outside finance, incentivizing clinical trial participants, incentivizing surrogate mothers, and so forth, it doesn't look like monetary incentives predictably cause worse decision qualities in the way that the ethicists have hypothesized. So it's very hard to produce evidence for this undue inducement hypothesis. And that led me to segue into positive welfare economics. The undue inducement hypothesis is a conjecture about how humans would behave, and as I've shown you, it's not a correct conjecture. People do have mistaken beliefs and biases about what would be good and bad for others. I've also shown you, when we look at how people want to intervene paternalistically with others, there's also systematic biases there. People behave as if they want to impose their own preferences on others. People do not correctly predict what the effects of their interventions are going to be, and so we know that at least in part, these interventions must be mistaken. Now, there's many more policy domains, there's many more interesting questions to address. Food labelings, energy consumption, health decisions, and so forth. So there is much, much more to do in this literature, and I hope to do a lot of that in the time to come here. So thank you very much for listening to me for these 45 minutes, and we're going to have an apéro, I think, downstairs in the Lichthof. Thank you for coming.